That week, the sky was not blue. It was a burden, a warning, and no one listened. The summer of 2032 became known as the silence of January. No birds sang. The leaves of the trees did not dance with the wind because there was no wind. People walked slowly on the streets of hot stone, protecting their heads with whatever they had: towels, bags, cardboard boxes. In Santa Cruz del Este, a city in the interior of Brazil known for its vines and mild temperatures, the thermometer hit 48.7 degrees Celsius. On the first day, the heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unbearable. Hospitals were packed with the elderly, dehydrated children, and people with burnt skin, even without direct sun. The energy fluctuated. Fans have become luxury items. The asphalt began to melt. Literally. Shoes stuck to the floor like chewing gum. Animals died in the sun. And, to make matters worse, there was no rain forecast for at least 20 days. On the outskirts of the city lives the family of Lúcia, 38, a single mother of 2 children, Vinicius, 15, and Clara, 6. The house had raw concrete walls, a tin roof, and only one window in each room. What was already hot became a thermal trap. On the first night of the heat wave, Lúcia woke up to Clara vomiting. The girl's forehead burned. "My God," she said, desperate. "She's dehydrating. There was no electricity at that time. Not even water." Lúcia ran to the fridge, took the last 600-milliliter bottle, and wet her daughter's lips with cotton. Vinicius woke up to the scene. He said nothing. He just ran to the laundry basin and poured the little water he had saved from the previous week's rain. They were improvising survival, and it was still the 3rd day of the wave. On the 7th day, schools were closed. The death toll was rising. 14 elderly people in a nursing home without a generator. 5 children in a daycare center where fans melted the wiring. A lady was found on her couch, melted next to a fan turned off. The city government declared an emergency, but the water trucks could not serve even 10% of the city. Water was rationed, 1 liter per person per day. Lúcia took 2 buckets, one for her, one for the children. "That's all we have," she said. On the radio, a new alert. The next 5 days could reach temperatures of up to 51 degrees Celsius. The authorities recommend that everyone stay indoors and hydrated. But what places are closed? What hydration? When the water runs out, despair begins to run through the veins. Santa Cruz del Este looked like a ghost town, but with the heat like an invisible monster that consumed everything. Businesses closed, markets had empty shelves, and the streets, almost deserted, were taken over by residents in search of shade and water. Vinicius sat on the doorstep looking at the empty street. Clara, lying on the cold kitchen floor, held her mother's hand, who did her best to keep calm. "Mom, when will the rain return?" Vinicius asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know, son," Lucy replied, looking up at the cloudless sky. At the municipal hospital, doctors were racing against the clock. The emergency room was packed. Patients arrived with severe signs of heat stroke, dehydration, and skin infections aggravated by heat. The electricity fluctuated constantly, making it difficult to use the devices. The emergency generator worked hard. Dr. Renato, the head of the emergency, has spent the last few days without sleep. At one point, he looked out the window and saw a child passed out in the middle of the street. She rushed to help, with the help of nurses and residents who were trying to save lives. On the 10th day, a dust storm formed in the distance, announcing what seemed to be the only hope, but which could also be a new threat. The hot wind brought particles that irritated the lungs. People with respiratory problems were immediately hospitalized. Lúcia saw Vinicius cough hard. I knew that at any moment it could get worse. "I need to work," she said, worried, but there was no job in that city, nor future. On community radio, the announcer spoke in a choked voice. Authorities confirm this is the worst heat wave ever recorded in the history of the region. Doctors warn of a serious risk of death if temperatures do not drop in the coming days. Lucia closed her eyes and hugged her children. At that moment, his house was not a shelter. It was a prison. And the clock did not stop. When the air you breathe weighs more than the world, hope becomes an act of resistance. The days dragged on in Santa Cruz del Este like an endless nightmare. The sun looked like a huge, open, merciless eye, watching every movement, burning everything it touched. At the city's community center, a small group gathered to try to find solutions. Lúcia, with tired eyes, participated with other residents. "We need help," she said, her voice breaking. "Water, medicine, anything." The group's coordinator, a young man named Marcos, frantically wrote everything down. Calls to the government and international NGOs brought vague answers or deferred promises. Meanwhile, at Lucia's house, Vinicius tried to help his little sister. "I took it to the backyard in the late afternoon when the sun began to give way." "Stay here, Clara, until we get water," he said, trying to distract his sister with stories he made up on the spot. That same day, Clara began to have a high fever and difficulty breathing. Lucia panicked. "She needs a hospital," he repeated, almost voiceless. With no money, no transportation, and with the city paralyzed, the despair only increased. At the hospital, the number of children with respiratory infections grew by the hour. Doctors and nurses worked grueling shifts without a break. Dr. Renato, exhausted, made a difficult decision. "We will prioritize the most serious cases," he announced to the team. It was a sentence that no one wanted to hear. In addition to the burns and dehydration, the extreme heat triggered silent waves of disease. Asthma, bronchitis, and other respiratory ailments increased alarmingly. Children, the elderly, and people with chronic diseases were the most affected. The heat also affected mental health. Anxiety, panic, depression, problems that no one saw but that ran like invisible fire. Lucia felt all this in her chest. The desire to give up grew along with the feeling of helplessness. On the 15th consecutive night of the wave, a momentary truce. Heavy clouds covered the sky. A slow, timid storm, but one that brought the first smell of rain in almost 3 weeks. Lucia, her children, and the residents went out to feel the dew on their skin, as if it were a miracle. At that moment, an invisible promise was made in the air. The end of the last wave could be coming. Not every storm brings immediate relief. Sometimes, the damage remains in the silence that remains. The rain that fell that morning was not enough to erase the memory of the fire that burned the city. Santa Cruz del Este was destroyed, but alive. Flooded streets mixed mud with ash from dry leaves. The smell of wet earth brought hope, but also sadness for what had already been lost. Lucia and her children barely slept. Clara, with her health still fragile, needed constant care. Vinicius was exhausted, but he tried to keep a smile for his mother. In the days that followed, help began to arrive, slowly, insufficiently, but really. NGOs mobilized teams to distribute drinking water, medicine, and food. Volunteer doctors arrived to reinforce the hospital. The city has launched an emergency plan to repair infrastructure, especially water and power systems. Lucia, despite her fatigue, joined a group of volunteers to help families who lost almost everything. But the fight was not only physical. Clara, who had survived the respiratory crisis, began to live with a chronic lung disease. Vinicius, once a cheerful young man, now showed signs of anxiety and constant fear. Lucia felt the weight of it all on her skin and in her soul. The extreme heat had not only burned the city, but also their hopes. At the end of that year, Santa Cruz del Este, adopted measures to try to prepare for future heat waves, creation of public shelters with air conditioning, warning systems, environmental education. Lucia and her family were part of this movement. "We can't let this happen again," she said. The last wave was not just a climate crisis. It was a warning about human vulnerability in the face of climate change, on the urgent need for collective action. For Lucia, for her children, and for thousands like them, that experience marked their lives forever. But it also lit a flame, that of resisting, rebuilding, and fighting. The heat passed, but it left in each survivor a spark, not of fire, but of urgency. Santa Cruz del Este was no longer the same, not because of the cracked buildings or the dry trees, but for the people. There was a new kind of look on faces, a mixture of pain and purpose, of those who have lost too much to continue waiting for solutions to fall from the sky. Lucia was invited to give an interview to a community radio. He sat in front of an old microphone with Clara on his lap and Vinicius by his side. "I'm not a scientist, nor a politician, nor an expert," he said. "But I know what it's like to see your son get sick because the sky boiled and no one did anything. And if I can tell someone to listen, let him listen." The interview went viral. Simple, sincere, raw. People from all over Brazil started sending messages, letters, donations. Marcos, the coordinator of the community group, called Lucia for a larger proposal. "We can found a network, an association, from cities that suffered from heat waves, who exchanged experiences, who created resilience plans." Lucia thought for a few seconds. A network of survivors. Exactly. The embryo of the last wave network was born there. A non-partisan, popular, real social movement. The first action was simple, a printed guide distributed from house to house with survival tips, water access routes, first aid, and emergency contacts. Then came joint efforts to plant trees in urban areas, install community reservoirs, and solar panels on public roofs. Clara, now 7 years old, started to walk with a firecracker in her pocket. He had occasional crises, but he took life lightly. At a network event, she was called to plant the first tree of a new climate rehabilitation park in the city center. Vinicius, in turn, began to study meteorology. He discovered a passion for climate maps, by the data, by the weather forecast. "I want to understand what will happen before it happens," he said. Lucia did not forget the heat, nor the deaths, nor the feeling of seeing the city melting. But he also did not forget the day when the rain returned. And she decided that her life would be dedicated to ensuring that other mothers didn't have to go through what she went through. In a new interview, this time for an international documentary, she closed by saying, "We don't control the weather, but you can control how much you ignore it. And I chose never to ignore it again." A local story, told with truth, is capable of crossing borders and shaking nations. 2 years after the Great Heat Wave, the name Santa Cruz del Este was on the maps. But not because of the grapes, rural tourism, or centuries-old churches. It was there as a milestone of popular climate resistance. The Last Wave network has spread to more than 80 cities. He became a model. Its practical and accessible actions have been recognized by universities, NGOs, and even international bodies. No bureaucracy, without millions of reas, only with will, sweat, and shared survival. Lucia, who had never traveled by plane, was invited to speak at a climate congress in São Paulo. She went on stage with simple clothes and her heart racing. "I didn't come to speak as a technician. I came to speak as a mother, and to say that if the heat has reached us, it will knock on everyone's door. The difference is what we're going to do before the next wave." The audience was silent. Then he stood up in applause. Vinicius, now 17, got a scholarship in climatology in Curitiba. I was already publishing articles on scientific blogs and creating educational videos for young people to understand climate change. We need to learn the language of the planet, he said, because he's been screaming for a long time, but we weren't listening. Clara, in turn, became a national symbol of overcoming. He recorded a children's campaign to warn about heat waves. He used his firecracker with pride and said to other children, "This doesn't stop me from going after what I want. It just reminds me to take better care of the air." In Santa Cruz, the heat returned the following year. Strong, intense, but different. Now there were alerts, tanks, shelters prepared, protocols, response teams. No one was alone. And more importantly, no one thought it was an exaggeration. Schools taught climate education. The health posts were equipped. The city had been transformed, not only in concrete and logistics, but in mentality. International newspapers began to visit Santa Cruz to document the Lúcia model. The BBC, Al Jazeera, and even the UN sent teams. Lúcia, in front of the cameras, always said the same phrase. "I only told what I experienced. The rest were people who decided to listen." Some endings are not a tragedy. They are catharsis. They are beginnings. On the morning of January 2nd, 2035, it was exactly 3 years since the worst heat wave in the history of Santa Cruz do Leste. The city has not forgotten. I didn't even want to forget. In the central square, where a dry and abandoned fountain used to be, there was now a hanging garden, created with irrigation by reusing rainwater, solar panels, and an ecological cooling system. And in the middle of the garden, a sign, "Here we are reborn." Lúcia, Vinicius, and Clara were there, together, alive, strong. The event brought together residents, volunteers, scientists, young people, and even representatives of other Brazilian cities, all for a symbolic ceremony, planting the last seedling of Ipe roxo, a native species, which symbolized the closing of the cycle of pain and the opening of the cycle of preparation. Lucy picked up the shovel. With his hands marked, he bent down slowly. Clara helped her hold the trunk. Vinicius adjusted the hole in the ground. "This tree is not to be forgotten," she said. "It's to remember, every day, that we survived and that we learned." The crowd applauded, and at that moment, the sky, by coincidence or poetry, collapsed in rain. Not an aggressive storm, but a clean, fresh, light rain. Drops fell on Lucia's face like tears of something greater. People raised their arms, some cried, others laughed. There was silence, and there was music coming from one's own emotions. Lúcia currently works as a consultant for climate public policies. She receives letters from other mothers in dry cities, flooded cities, forgotten cities. She answers them all. Vinicius finished his graduation with honors. His final paper was "How Trauma Can Anticipate the Future, the Case of Cities That Survived Thermal Collapse." Clara dreams of being an architect. He wants to build schools that cool in the heat, let them shelter, that they protect. On the mural of the Community Support Center, there is a phrase painted by Clara with blue paint. "The next wave may come, but now we know how to swim.